What is it about place that catches your interest?
I constantly find myself in place, either in terms of my imagination or as one already significantly located. Place always takes priority. I've been troubled by the way in which place gets covered over by a plethora of topological concepts, such as the historical, the architectural, the geometrical, the literary, and the religious, and the way it becomes dominated either by its designation as a simple location or overshadowed by its name and all the connotations that accrue around that.
Why should all these be troubling?
I have a strong sense that they are evasive notions, ones that are predominantly highly pragmatic in their application. They serve as useful shortcuts, enabling a sort of svelte navigation, a fluent engagement with whatever is there. But they are also substitutional for something far more originary. And it is this obscured originariness that captures my interest. It is something that is overlooked in many discourses. Instead, the pragmatic seems to lead in a self-evidential kind of way, leaving little motivation to go beyond that.
So why is the pragmatic so significantly obscuring?
Well, under the pragmatic, place collapses into a fixed designation. It remains or becomes whatever is purposed for it. There is a sort of pre-existing quality about all this. Place is deemed to already exist as whatever it is said to be. It has a handy accessibility, one that can be entered in a confident manner, one in which ambiguities have already been excluded. This exclusion simplifies our engagement with it and raises the pragmatic status to one of primacy. Place becomes what it is said to be. There is a sense that the word speaks place. It becomes a kind of utterance.
What is wrong with utterance? Doesn't it bring together that which we can then see and that which we can recognize and then come to understand?
Well, it certainly does that by making accessible that which would otherwise be dispersed. And it does so, mostly, in the form of a lucid longitudinal narrative. But narrative curtails, it cuts off, it makes place explicable simply as an effect of its format, and not simply by what it says and what it doesn't say. From that perspective, narrative's content is irrelevant. Utterance as narrative also has the capacity to reduce curiosity by sending out a fixed and feeble signal of that which it designates. Also, more importantly, it imposes a cohering effect, one that abridges, explains, and finalizes what place is, as if there's little more that can be said.
It's as if you don't see much virtue in anything that can ever be said about place.
Rather, it is more to do with the narrating style and the narrating effect themselves. Both of these have the power to bestow certainty in a story-like manner, to bestow it over that which cannot so easily be cohered. It's like gathering up a pile of sticks, and by the very act of bringing them together, claiming that a solid structure has been created, one which now becomes whatever the other is. Utterance, as narration, turns place into a sort of pinned specimen, one that can be viewed, displayed, and preserved. It's the fixing that's the problem, the solidifying of something, the bringing to a standstill, the making static of that which is essentially generative. Often the ostensible stolidness of place lends itself to this treatment.
You've just used the word stolidness. A few synonyms for that are unresponsive, dull, inert. It isn't place like that until we do something about it.
A few years ago, I went for a walk in a secluded countryside wilderness, accompanied by a fine artist. At one point, while strolling at the side of a remote little river, we came upon a hidden place where a series of small cascading waterfalls receded into the distance. We stood below them for quite some time, looking up, watching them flow down towards us. Suddenly, my companion asked aloud, "What am I looking at?" It was a transformative question, one that silenced me. It was a question that stopped me from answering it. It's a question I have not attempted to answer since.
So why the self-imposed silence?
I stood by that little river, dumbfounded. But when I asked the question to myself, what am I looking at? It revealed something that evaded the singularity of any one answer. I was struck by the arbitrariness of my presence, of my arrived position in front of that waterfall. I had suddenly disappeared as being non-necessary for that place. It didn't need my endorsing consciousness to collectivize its reality into a single handy response. Let us remember, only a few seconds ago, I said, whilst strolling at the side of a remote little river, we came upon a hidden place where a series of small cascading waterfalls receded into the distance. Whatever place is, it's certainly not that. Its complexity cannot be collapsed into a summarizing and handy comprehensiveness, one that renders it accessibly understandable. Rather, there is an already existing resistance that place possesses, one which often provokes an extinguishing response to overcome it.
What exactly is this already existing resistance the place possesses? And why would anyone ever be motivated to overcome it?
Earlier on, I said place always takes priority. What did I mean by that? Place doesn't need my sustained attentiveness in order to yield up what it is. But that's exactly what happens. Place becomes what I deem it to be, and that's where its resistance comes in. Any interaction with place cannot escape the arbitrariness of that encounter. Even though I am firmly intentional and quite specific regarding my contact with it, the already existing resistance the place possesses guarantees that it cannot be overcome by that motive. Also, after repeated encounters, my engagement with place may become highly thematized. I may already come to know what place is and predict how it will fulfill my purposes. It's an extinguishing response, and it's the extinguishing response that place resists.
But how on earth can familiar and typical encounters, ones we normally have with place, ever be considered as extinguishing?
Because they totalize. When those kinds of encounters are repeated, they solidify the totalization. The motive itself then makes those encounters more secure. The motive then becomes a portable platform of reassurance, a solid something we simply carry about as an assumed expectation.
You said something rather strange just then, namely, any interaction with place cannot escape the arbitrariness of that encounter. Why should our encounters be arbitrary? And we often have quite definite notions of what we are doing and what we are going to do.
No matter how many times they are repeated, our habitual encounters with place cannot cancel out the arbitrary. Place always takes priority. When we start with place and not with ourselves, we come to realize that our thematizing is actually something quite specific, one that stands out in a discrete, special kind of way. We see that it has no exceptional priority, even though its effects appear to be totalizing. It's just one of many in the arc of relation with place. We ourselves are just there in a non-necessary kind of way. We don't have any particular priority. We don't have to be there at all. That's what I intend by arbitrary.
But what if we do have to be there? What if we have to be there as one of those ordinary, simple, practical, basic exigencies of life?
Well, that's our affair, not places. Our exigencies don't derogate from place. In the arc of relation, we don't have to be there at all. In fact, there doesn't have to be an arc whatsoever. It's simply there as something asserted to account for our arbitrariness. Perhaps it's a mistake to call it an arc, as if singularizing something makes it more solidly definite. It would be better to say arcs.
So, not to say arc singular, but to say arcs plural. You seem to be suggesting that our relations with place are always going to be multiple in some way.
They are. But the question is still the wrong way round. Place is the priority, not our relations with it. We abolish the priority of place when we thematize it. Thematization always creates officially endorsed remnants, the one we prefer to look at. We pretend that there's nothing else there but themes, as if there is nothing else left over once we've thematized it. Someone once said, "No ideas but in things." We reverse that dictum into "no things but in ideas." A small pile of remnants might signify a place thematized to death.
Right at the beginning of our conversation, you referred to something far more originary about place. What are you getting at in your use of the word originary?
Originary is not an unknown word in English, but it is uncommon. And I have saved it because it points towards something both veiled and unavoidable. Although place may be where we dwell as our home, the anchored and familiar homestead which we inhabit, nonetheless, our presence there is always interventionist. Place resists being overloaded with familiarity. We can never get to place simply through intimate know-how or affectionate attachment. Nor can we make it ours by any of those means. In fact, we can never make it ours at all.
All this sounds rather harsh and unnecessarily austere, and so very far from the genuinely deep feelings people have about hearth and home, and all the other special places that they love and live in.
I once wrote, place has myriad platforms of inception. These platforms are not depleted by those deep feelings, nor are they dominated by them. Place is generative, as full of origins, but without attributable foundations. Either knowingly or unknowingly, we place ourselves in the way of these. That's why our presence is interventionist and arbitrary. We simply don't have to be there.
That's not a very pleasant thing to hear, is it? You are describing place as a somewhere, a location, maybe a sort of weird, inaccessible island where people can never be at home, except as permanently alienated individuals, forever set apart.
But that's not true either, is it? People do feel at home. They do have deep feelings about where they dwell, and they do live out their lives in the light of all that. But here, in this place, and at this time, place takes priority. We are not starting with people and their relations with place.
Earlier on, you said place is generative. What exactly do you mean by generative?
I've indicated that place does not yield itself up very willingly. We thwart what is already there. We thwart it by overlaying it with cohering notions. So an answer to what am I looking at might well be, I already know what I'm looking at. But nothing will prevent place from being what it is. Even our interventionist, arbitrary presence doesn't actually stop anything. That's the point.
But does it stop it for us?
Yes, it does stop it for us, but not for place.
But if it stops it for us, what's left for place?
Everything. But being stopped for us does allow us the confidence to assert, I already know what I'm looking at. Simple notions of location encourage this. If I'm already in place, already there, so to speak, already here, I might be so reassured by the habitual rootedness of my position that whenever I look out for my personal overseeing watchtower, it may become the authoritative default standpoint that stops the everything of place. It will bring it to a halt.
I now feel tempted to ask, how can we ever find out what place is? How can we get ourselves into a position of ever discovering that? How could such an exploration ever be carried out? But I feel that in asking all these questions, I would be reversing the position of place as having priority, by simply turning the focus back onto we ourselves?
Yes, you would. But that reversal is ever with us. It's unavoidable. Earlier on, I said place is generative. And then you asked, what exactly do you mean by generative? So, to address your challenge bluntly, the generative is atomized, while the narrative is cohered. The former resurges, while the latter brings it to a halt. Whatever is of the generative comes straight out in an entirely fragmentary way, its terse, gnomic utterances hardening one after the other into stark and eruptive incongruities and paradoxes. Narrative cannot abide this. It must level them out into a smooth, intelligible format. It coheres them inappropriately, so to speak. But the gnomic itself is generative. It has an almost genetic affinity with its source. It is full of origins, but without attributable foundations.
But that first question still remains. How can we ever find out what place is?
An author once used the phrase "under the net" as a title for her first novel. It's a phrase that points succinctly to where we are in all this. We are under the net. It's our position in relation to place. It is a metaphor for an entrapment that not only precedes us, but is a firmament under which we abide and have our being.
So, are you saying that the security we establish in our everyday lives, the daily routines, the rituals, the intimate familial relationships, our rich engagement with history are, in connection with place, wholly under the net?
They are, all of them.
So, do we ever get out from under the net, or are we stuck there, never able to escape?
Well, that author went on to say, we must be ruled by the situation itself, and then added, it is something to which we can never get close enough. Place is like that. Whenever we avoid being ruled by the situation in itself, we don't get to get out from under the net, and we don't get close enough to place itself. But that notion of being close, of being nearer, is also a temptation, a seductive method of how to get there, one that has remnants of the net still clinging to it. It draws us into the notion of an accomplishable goal, into a method that is simply realizable by some sort of engineered proximity. All we have to do is get closer. But the notion of getting closer is seductive not only because it leaves out the very arbitrariness of our presence, but it also insinuates that a method, can extinguish that arbitrariness. Nevertheless, what we may think, feel, or imagine where we live and where we feel at home, the arbitrariness of our presence reveals no presumption of being close. To put it bluntly, we have to place ourselves, we have to be in the way of place in such a way that when we are there, we are able to accept whatever comes on and recognize that whatever is being generated in that place may be entirely unacceptable. In responding to your question, how can we ever find out what place is? It's not so much a quest to find out what place is, but more an exposure, an exposing, a being exposed to the generative resurgence that place begets.
You used a word back then, the word unacceptable. It's one that sounds disapprovingly starchy and a bit out of context with the mood being created and with what you were saying.
To be exposed to whatever comes on is to abandon the protective cover of narrative, thematization, the logically expected, and the solid pragmata of whatever is deemed useful. To be exposed is to be unguarded in refusing the net as a safety filter for whatever is acceptable or not. It is being exposed to ambiguity, contradiction, paradox, and the nonsensical. It is being faithful in maintaining a steady integrity towards whatever comes on, and in denying any burgeoning narrative. Is being poised to receive the startling persistence of unexpected connections, being open to the eruptive, abrupt appearances of incisively disconnected fragments, and in having actually to be there, in situ, so to speak, readied for whatever place unveils.
So is that what you meant when you said that place always takes priority?
We always have to be somewhere, but we don't have to be anywhere. Neither the somewhere nor the anywhere depends on us, but it is impossible for us to be nowhere.
Near the beginning, when we first started on our dialogue, you spoke of a series of small cascading waterfalls receding into the distance and your inability to respond to the question asked by your companion, what am I looking at? Is that inability still an issue?
Yes, it is. My silence, or my inability, as you put it, undeniably stops something from happening, but it also allows the possibility of something else. When I use the word allow, it doesn't mean that I'm giving place, permission to do or be something, or the place comes into existence for the first time simply because I'm there. But rather I am acknowledging that there is a distance between recognition and understanding. Distance is more a chasm, an unbridgeable rift in which understanding is rarely reached by any direct or convenient means. Moreover, I don't have to proceed to understanding. I don't have to understand as a precondition or as a consequence of recognition. I can stay with recognition. I particularly don't have to make recognition intelligible. Recognition exposes the chasm. Narrative and thematization hide it. The chasm keeps the generative open. Thematization and narrative close it down. So when I am silenced by that question, what am I looking at? The chasm is already there and I am looking out across it. The chasm makes recognition possible.
Surely you can't just remain with recognition. Surely something has got to happen to make place intelligible. Otherwise, everything is either lost or never gets started?
Well, from your question, it would seem that recognition is simply staying resolutely within a state of wonder and not doing anything about it, as simply remaining silent, nor letting the story come out, nor letting it be recorded or told, with the result that other people can never come to see what I am seeing, nor ever discovering what place really is. As I said earlier, it's not so much a quest to find out what place is, but more an exposure and exposing, a being exposed to the generative resurgence the place begets. But there are consequences resulting from this exposure, one being a definite helplessness, another being a lack of mastery, together with an absence of rehearsed preparedness and an overriding sense of, I don't have to be in place at all.
Have you noticed that you persistently take yourself out of the picture, leaving place to itself? But what happens if you are actually within the picture, absolutely in place, with you and place now left together? What happens when you are fully exposed to what you call the generative resurgence that place begets? What happens within that exposure?
Your question is actually a very ancient one, a question that has appeared in various disguises over the centuries. One of its first versions occurred 2.5 millennia ago as a 7 or 8 word fragment, one fragment among other fragments, a fragment deliberately written as such, not simply as a surviving lucky leftover of a longer lost text. It basically says this: how can one escape the notice of that which never sets? It bears repeating. How does one escape the notice of that which never sets? It puts the one that might escape, the one that might attempt to hide away, firmly and always within the purview of that which does not come into existence simply by being named, thematized, recognized, narrated, or understood. Out of that ancient question, a parallel association with place ensues, especially when place takes priority. It certainly reverses the position, doesn't it?
Nevertheless, that question still remains. What happens within that exposure? What happens within that reversal?
Certainly not narratives, but fragments. The fragmentary is the language of place. It is a language generated at source, in situ, so to speak, in disconnected, discrete utterances coming straight out, separate and entire. So our being in the way of and not escaping the notice of that which never sets, so to speak, is our constant inauguration into the unstable. Everything is unexpected. There's nothing to build on. You have to be there as one unready, destabilized, and already beginning again, in situ.